Native Americans are in a crisis. Many of them are suffering, many of them are impoverished, and many of them are not getting the help needed from the government that so promised them the help long ago. You're probably wondering, why is a hiking channel making a video about Native Americans and the crises they're facing? This is a video that is near and dear to my heart. I have spoken to many Native people on my journeys through hiking, and I have learned about their struggles, and I feel a need to share their struggles with you. I hope you learned something. The origins of Native reservations have a history that is largely based in anti-Semitism. Native reservations were established in 1851 when Congress passed the Indian Appropriation Act. This act was not created for the purpose of protecting sacred native land, but was instead used to segregate Native Americans into sections of seemingly non-profitable land in order to better control them. For instance, back when the act was first passed, Native Americans had to ask for permission in order to be able to leave the reservations. This act was followed by the Dawes Act in 1887, which sought to further assimilate natives into white Christian culture by allowing white settlers to come onto reservations and purchase more of their sacred land. This severely backfired and ended up worsening the lives of many natives and destroyed relations between natives and the federal government. Thus, a new act was established almost 50 years later in 1934 called the Indian Reorganization Act. This act was a large improvement to the other acts. It encouraged natives to self-govern as well as promoted the partaking of traditional cultural practices and granted natives more land than they had previously been given. But the trials and hardships of the native people were far from over. Today there are around 580 recognized tribal groups in the United States, all facing a multitude of issues, some doing better than others. Self-governing for native reservation largely works the same as state governments. They can determine the use of the land as well as the laws that must be followed on the land, in addition to a multitude of other things. Reservations are subject to federal law. The primary organization tasked with managing the communications between the federally organized self-governing native reservations and the federal government is known as the BIA, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Despite all these seemingly beneficial laws in place that seek to protect natives and their way of life, the conditions of many of those living on native reservations are suffering greatly. This video will tackle 5 of the current crises facing native groups in the U.S. Crises involving food, water, violence and sexual assault, poverty, healthcare, and land. Around 60 native reservations are considered to be what is called food deserts. Food deserts are when the tribe and the land around the tribe has no actual way of producing food itself, so food must be imported. And since natives largely live in poverty, imported food is not a cost they can afford. Many of the imported foods include fast food convenience stores and fast food in general. This is obviously not the best and most healthy options for the natives, which leads to a lot of health problems down the line. So this leads to extremely high rates of vitamin deficiencies and health deficiencies and health problems such as diabetes. In fact, natives suffer diabetes at a rate of 3.2 times higher than the national average. And usually they don't have the medical facilities needed to be able to treat the disease, so a lot of people perish. In addition to food, water is another thing that natives find it hard to come by. The reality is, around 58 out of every 1,000 Native Americans in the country do not have access to running water or plumbing. This is an even more scary fact on the Navajo Nation reservation, where a staggering 30% of all Navajo Nation individuals do not have access to basic plumbing and must leave their premises to go to a local well or water source in order to fill up on water for the entire week. This includes bathing, cooking, and drinking water. So as you can see, there's already quite a dryness problem in the Navajo Nation, which is why a lot of people have to travel great distances to get water for their home. Because bear in mind, 30% of Navajo Nation individuals are without basic plumbing. And that's just a sad, sad fact of the matter. After this, we're going to visit another thing that relates to the water crisis and the reason why even when people go out of their way to find wells and sources of water near their houses, it might not always be safe. Let's talk a little bit about radioactivity. Sadly, Native Americans are no stranger to radiation. The United States government has conducted several hundred nuclear tests on sacred native land. The Shoshone got this worse when over 500 nuclear tests were conducted on sacred sites. This is not the only problem that radiation causes for reservations. For the worst contamination problem in the recorded history of the United States is on the reservation system. Near the Navajo Nation and in the Navajo Nation, 520 uranium mines were left abandoned, causing contamination to seep into the groundwater and radioactive dust to be blown across the land. This has caused severe health issues for a lot of Native Americans in the area, has spiked cancer rates, and has effectively lowered the lifespan of millions. Hey everybody, I'm here at the Charles Huskin #1 mine. I have a friend here with me. This is a random stray dog that ran up to us. He's pretty friendly. I'm talking right now about the uranium mines that are behind us. There used to be 520 of these spread around the Navajo Nation back in the heyday, which was obviously very terrible for the local native population. Groundwater from places like the Little Colorado River in Cameron, that's just over that bend there, would seep into the ground below these uranium mines, and it would get, obviously poisonous. And all the wells that are in this area that would tap up the groundwater so that all the residences could have access to water were not having access to clean water because of this. And this has led to a spike of cancer rates, a spikes of terrible diseases that just go on and on and on because of this problem. And it still remains a problem to this day, even though uranium mines ceased around 30 years ago. In fact, mining in general destroys native lands. Copper mining, silver mining, gold mining, and yes, uranium mining, like we just talked about, seeps materials that get into the groundwater and just make it not safe to drink. Drinking this water can end up staining your teeth, can end up worsening your quality of life. It's not safe for children to drink, and yet we're not doing anything about it. We're not doing anything about it. Since mining began on native reservations around 100 years ago, over 161,000 hard rock mines have been open on native reservations, with only 5% of the profits going to the natives that helped build and work in the mines. This is terrible considering that these mines caused major contamination issues, which have led to problems like the birth defect rates in native reservations being 50% higher than the national average. Mining isn't the only problem that interferes with water. In fact, damming is a large problem as well. The Gila River is a great example of this. The Gila River's headwaters are in New Mexico, and in New Mexico it is largely allowed to run free. But the second that it crosses into the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona State, it is essentially dammed and farmed until it turns into nothing more than a wash. This is a sacred river that used to supply water to hundreds and hundreds of natives that used to occupy the land, and now it is nothing more than an empty, barren wasteland for most of it. Allow me to open up the next part of the video with a grisly statistic. 1 out of every 3 Native American women living on a reservation is raped within their lifetime. There's no good way of approaching the topic of sexual assault, so allow me to list off some rather horrific statistics. More than half of all Native women have reported instances of sexual assault. 48% of Native women have been stalked, and over 55% of Native women have been violently assaulted in a domestic dispute. Men are not safe from the terrible fate of sexual assault and violence either, with around 70% of Native men saying they have encountered some form of psychological trauma from a domestic dispute, and around 45% saying they've been physically assaulted. Most of these heinous acts done upon Native Americans are not even committed by other Native Americans. They're committed by outsiders to the reservation. Due to this discrepancy, Tribal law on reservations has a hard time applying to these people that commit these heinous acts because they largely escape the tribal law system and dissipate into the federal system that the tribal system has a hard time keeping track of. There is a big disconnect between tribal and federal law, which leads to a lot of these cases going cold and many perpetrators walking away scot-free. Behind me is the Navajo Nation Council Chambers, a very important building for making legislative decisions for the entirety of the Navajo Nation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the legal system on reservations now that I got this amazing opportunity to do so. So it's much like states' rights and state legislation. The Navajo Nation and many other reservations are able to establish their own rules on the reservation, but they still have to abide by general federal law. And also there's a stipulation. Any crime that they try someone for on the reservations can only be held in prison for up to 3 years unless it is brought to a federal level and tried on a federal court. In a lot of cases, it is not brought to the federal level. And this is due in part to a lack of evidence and many state officials not being equipped to handle dealing with the intricacies of crimes committed against natives on reservations. With natives experiencing assault rates of 1.2 to 1.3 times higher than the national average, this is an obvious and terrible problem that is occurring. It is crucial that we do something about this. It is crucial that we wake up and let others around us know that Native Americans are suffering. Thank you for watching part 1.